Good day, Journalism 2 students, and welcome to Professional Journalism Principles and Values, Good Journalism, Good Values, Why Media Values Matter. I am Jude Mathurin, and I'll be taking you through this next online class, and we'll be proceeding in the form of an online video. Please have a notepad and pen ready to take notes. Hopefully you're also near some internet access, so you can also take a look at some of the other videos and resources that we will look at as part of this class. So here are some instructions to get you through this as an online instructional video. First of all, watch this video presentation, use the pause button often and take notes. Second, in your notes, make sure you record certain things like key concepts. Make sure that you look at other readings to properly identify them. If I mention any authors, if I mention any philosophers, if I mention any theorists, take them down. And please make sure you look at the related readings that I'll provide in the next set of slides. Watch the videos and find the links indicated in the text. This will give you context. Please make sure you take a look at the readings on Blackboard. Now, for this particular lesson, we need to take a look at the Press Council Code of Practice. Does it make sense having it available electronically? Please find a way to print out the Press Council Code of Practice, go through it and mark it up, because we're going to be looking at news values in terms of the Press Council Code of Practice. So we kill two birds with one stone. Next, what's always really important when it comes to ethics is to think about the kind of ethical dilemmas that journalists actually face in the workplace. Preferably South African, please. I know people tend to cut and paste American examples, but please, we want to look at South African examples and how we resolve them in a local context. This lesson and the one to follow relates to your assignment, and that assignment has already been posted on Blackboard. It is a blog post which focuses, among other things, on the issue of news values, and you can use this as a resource to help you answer the question. Alright, if we're not back in class, or even if we are, if you have any questions regarding this particular instructional video around key concepts or ideas or examples, please tweet them to me using the hashtag Journ2. On Twitter using your Twitter. Let's move on to your resources. You're going to want to take these down. I've been recommending the Nell reading and the chapter on ethics and the responsible journalist in writing for the media in Southern Africa fairly often. So please make sure you go and at least photocopy that specific chapter. As I pointed out, you'll also need a copy of the Press Council Code of Conduct on Blackboard, and you should also familiarize yourself, with those of you going to broadcasting and those not, with the BCCSA, the Broadcasting Complaints Commission on South Africa Code of Practice. That is also on Blackboard, as is the BBC's, as is SABC. So make sure you look at all of them, so you know exactly what goes into a code of practice for each specific kind of organization. Johan Retief, who happens also to have been a press ombudsman, wrote a book in 2002 called Media Ethics: An Introduction to Responsible Journalism. You'll find a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss happen to be in the first chapter of that book. So let's move on. What we've looked at in our course so far is we've looked at some of the theory of ethics. What is ethics? Where does it come from? How have different philosophers and thinkers conceptualized ethical models through the ages? What's the difference between ethics and law? What's the difference between morals and ethics? And in this particular class, we now start to get down to brass tacks. We start to look at the professional values through which journalism survives as a professional practice. You might recall in my first class you said ethics is all about values, and when we talk about media ethics, we're talking about media professional values. And so it's important then to know what kind of values are we talking about, because when you make a process of ethical legitimation, when you try to make an argument about why you did or didn't do something, it's important not just to use those meta-ethical frameworks that help you think through a problem, but also think about the very specific values that underpin your profession so that you're able to apply them in situ. Right, so what is ethics? Ethics assess the nature of voluntary human behavior insofar as we can judge whether an action, in some cases the motive for the action, is right or wrong based on a determinative set of principles or values. So, some important aspects is that the nature must be voluntary. It can't be involuntary, it can't be forced. The second aspect of it is we look at either the motive, what caused the action, or the results thereof. Okay, deontology, teleology, okay? And then we have to look at a determinative set of principles, the professional principles that underpin a particular discipline or the professional principles that underpin a particular practice. And that's what we're looking at today. So what is value? Value is merely a preference for a particular principle or action. It's not written in stone. Any value-based practice is normative. It says what people ought to do. And so media ethics is about saying what good journalists and what good media companies ought to do. It's a preference for a particular kind of action, which usually has its outcome, usually has its goal, has the achievement of some kind of social good, a good life, a better society, democracy, development. Good values aspire to be the method by which we accomplish something higher, something worth striving for. Now, there are all kinds of values. There are personal values. There are community values. There are religious values. There are national values. There are political values. And of course, when it comes to journalism and medicine and the law, there are professional values. So we need to know what the professional values are for our discipline of journalism. When we take various values for different professions, religions, nations, or communities and aggregate them together, we develop value systems, systems of thought. And value systems are part of what underpins ideologies, that thing that you're studying in politics too. Value systems distinguish groups which might have different values or value preferences. For example, liberals value issues of freedom or liberty high, where socialists value issues around the equality and the community high. Right? So every system of thought has a system of underpinning values, and as a particular profession, journalism has a system of underpinning values. Now, as a consequence of the fact that values constitute value systems and value systems might differ between various groups, there are points at which values and value systems converge and come together, and it's very happy and they live together and everybody can agree on it, but there are points at which they diverge, and when they diverge, this is when the values between a particular profession or a particular group of people or a particular religion come into conflict with other people with different value systems. Divergence of values often results in conflicts. Now, we won't go into this into any great detail. It's just important to realize that when values come into conflict, sometimes this leads to bloody conflict over values. But what's important isn't the fact that values are in conflict. The question is, how does one resolve these conflicts? So divergence of values can often result in conflict between individuals, professionals, communities, and social groupings like political parties, religions, cults, even between journalists themselves, or even between media houses. Okay? Think of the kinds of differences in the values between a media house like Times, owned by Tisa Blackstar, and NASPAS and Media24 versus independent news and media and the New Age. Their difference isn't simply a difference of ownership, but a difference in the kinds of values that those owners and companies espouse. They all do journalism, but believe me, they have a different way of understanding journalism and its role in society. We'll touch on that in a moment by referring to my old colleague, Guy Berger. So there are differences in media value preferences between the journalism industry, within the journalism industry, and also between the journalism industry and the ruling party in South Africa. Let's think about that for a second. We said that journalism was based on a particular set of preferences, and values speak about what you can do with them in order to achieve the good society. But we've said that different kinds of value systems hold values differently, prioritize certain values, throw out other values, and value systems can come into conflict. One of the things and ways to conceptualize the conflict between the quote-unquote media in South Africa and the ruling party like the African National Congress is to perceive their core conflict around a clash of values that they don't necessarily think or understand about what the other is saying the role of journalism is in society, and have a differing opinion about journalistic values. Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women. Why on earth am I showing Arnold Schwarzenegger in one of his first movie roles as Conan the Barbarian? Well, it's all about value systems. As I pointed out, values are a means to an end. All right. In the movie Conan the Barbarian, Conan is asked what is best in life, and he espouses it in terms of this particular quote. It's the same thing with journalists and their values. Their values belong to value systems. And fairly frequently we try to take the things that are complex value systems and narrow them down to things that we can understand. Narratives, stories, a particular quote or idea. Why do you do journalism? To afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Why do you do journalism? So that we can make sure that everybody's views are heard in society. Why do you do journalism? To expose corruption. Those things become simple catchphrases, but they are symbols of an underpinning set of ideas and values about why journalism is valuable in society. Though not every. So Professor Guy Berger theorized how emphasis on particular kinds of ethical values can lead to very particular views of the role of journalism in society. The problem with journalists and students when they walk into an institution is they think that journalism is just one thing, and that all journalists think exactly the same way. There's this hegemonic thinking, but in actual fact, as you realize, if there are different value systems, there are also different value systems for journalists. Different journalists would prioritize different kinds of values, and this will influence what they produce, how they produce, the audiences they speak to, and particular kinds of outcomes. Professor Guy Berger is now the United Nations Director for Media Development and Freedom of Expression. Now, he held that while the discipline of journalism claims a broad set of values, some of these values include values like accuracy and balance and impartiality and fairness. While there is a broad set of values, some journalists hold that everyone should have these values equally and hold these values equally. But it's not the case. They do vary. And Guy Berger theorized around the role of media in democracy to show how this works. Not all media institutions or journalists hold all values in journalism equally. They vary between journalists and institutions and society. What do you understand what journalism is good for? Think about that. What do you think journalism is good for? Is it meant to enlarge the public space so people can talk about the issues of the day? Is it meant for better representation? Is it meant for rooting out corruption as part of the fourth estate to hold the other three arms of government to account? Any of those views that you hold of journalism is part of a value system. And that means that you belong to a distinct set of, or have a distinct set of values and views about what journalism is good for. The degree to which any journalist or media company esteems, raises some values higher than others influences the approach to the media's role in society. And in theory, we can then categorize how those media could be placed on a continuum in relation to the role of media in democracy. Sometimes a journalist's view and approach to this role differs from other organizations, example, a political party. And then we get a clash of values. And the question is, how is this explained? How is this reconciled? Well, it can only be explained and reconciled if the journalist, he or herself, has the means to explain what they're doing in terms of their professional values. Sometimes you might have to explain things to your friends or your family. And how do you do this? Not just by saying it's my job, but by trying to elaborate it in terms of your professional values. All right? Sometimes you might even have a conflict with your organization. How do we resolve these? We resolve these through a process of ethical legitimation, which is the core part of what we do on this course. So Berger highlighted several views of a media's role in democracy. What you'll see in relation to each of these is that each of the roles of the media in democracy, or the journalist's role in democracy, relates to how they esteem or value one core journalistic ethical value. For example, there's the liberal view of the role in journalism in democracy, which values and raises the idea of media freedom and liberty above everything else. In this view, journalism is seen as afflicting the comfortable, comforting the afflicted, in other words, exposing corruption, being the fourth estate, protecting liberty. That's what journalism is for. When we protect liberty, everyone's able to do whatever they want to because they are better informed. That is the watchdog model of journalism, which is closely associated with the liberal democratic model of journalism. If you want to think of a good example of a publication that does that, think the Sunday Times. So the Sunday Times as a publication will esteem certain kinds of journalistic values, potentially at the expense of others if it's a liberal medium. Then you get social democratic. Now, social democratic doesn't mean that they don't expose corruption or don't see themselves as a means to help society, but they're mainly concerned with what is known as responsible journalism. And their core value or role is about educating the public so that they can make their own decisions, empowering the base. There we can be seen as that is the guard dog model of journalism. It's not barking, it's not attacking, but it is guarding and protecting social values by educating the public. The British Broadcasting Corporation is incredibly good at this. But you can see the values that they will foreground because they have a social democratic. The neoliberal journalist focuses on the need to have free, independent, and plural media, where everyone says what they want under law in a free and rational public sphere. For the notion of public sphere, please look up the author Jürgen Habermas. The idea is that if you're able to simply foster an environment where everyone just can say what they want and everyone is shouting at each other, the idea is that in a space for the rational contestation of ideas, The best ideas will win, and that will advance society, and that will advance democracy. If you want to look at publications like this, think the Daily Maverick, think the Huffington Post, where people on the left, right, and center all get to write their opinions, and then people get to post comments and views on it. And the idea is that this will contribute to a more dynamic media space where people will be able to understand a multiplicity of different points of view. And then we get the participatory journalist, who sees journalism of this kind, particularly neoliberal journalism, as only serving elites. Because the kinds of issues that independent and free and plural media tends to advance in the public sphere tend not to represent everyone in society, not the little platoons, not the powerless. And so participatory journalism looks to involve the citizens, the public, in telling their own stories and empowering the public in fostering debate and contributing to public policy. So participatory media is all about citizen empowerment and involving the citizens and citizen groups so they are more active. But publications like this and more participatory journalism see Ground Up for examples. Okay, the kind of journalism that they do in organic communities and the journalists coming from those communities. Now, this is just an example of a theory that speaks to the media's role in a democratic system and different forms and models of journalism. But what this should point out to is that journalism is not just one thing. Journalists just don't think the same. Neither do media organizations. They might work with similar values, but they all place different emphases on different values in relation to what they see as the achieving necessary to achieve the ideal society. Not one of these is right or wrong. Ideally, you want a range of these different points of view so that you are able to have a more informed society and a better informed body politic. These four roles are not contradictory, Guy Berger says, but offer different ways for the journalist to view the role of the media in a democracy. So, what kind of journalist are you in democracy? Are you the social democrat? Do you fancy yourself as a participatory journalist? Are you a liberal? Are you neoliberal? There are other categories which I have omitted, but I would have required to use other authors and writers in order to get to them. I was just using something that would allow us to very simply look at this concept before moving on. What are your views on the media's role? What is the media good for? What is the media's role in society? What is the media's role for society? And finally, ask yourself this question. What values do you hold as primary when you try to resolve ethical problems? Do you hold community responsibility as being primary? Do you hold the issue of media freedom and independence as being primary? Do you hold the issue of trying to get multiple points of view to encourage debate as being primary? Each of these will have a particular effect on how you resolve a problem and also how other peoples and groups will view your problem and your solution. So, what are these good journalism values? So here's where you can pull out your copy of the South African press code, which you can print off Blackboard. In the press code preamble, which is really important, it says, as journalists, we commit ourselves to the highest standards of excellence to maintain credibility and keep the trust of our readers. This means always striving for truth, avoiding unnecessary harm, reflecting the multiplicity of voices in our coverage of events, and showing special concern for children and other vulnerable groups, and acting independently. In that one specific quote, we have a number of embedded journalistic values. We see avoiding unnecessary harm, which belongs to a utilitarian principle of maximizing benefit and minimizing harm. The notion of a multiplicity of voices, that you need to tell a more complete story by referring to multiple narratives that come from different pieces of and different parts of your community, because people might have different views of the facts. We see that there must be special concern for those who are most vulnerable, but we need to act independently and strive for truth. And truth means the values of accuracy. And so in the press code, in any journalistic press code, there are a number of embedded journalistic values, such as accuracy, which is related to the idea of truth, fair dealing, which is related to the idea of getting truth and also avoiding harm, impartiality, which is also about trying to get to the truth and ensuring that you can get access to a multiplicity of voices by not pissing off one side or another. Balance, by trying to at least show as many sides of the story as possible. Independence, by not being interfered or influenced by internal or external parties. Public interest, probably one of the most important journalistic values, and the reason that most countries will say that journalism exists to work and serve the public interest. And so in the next part of this lesson, we will discuss these values step by step. Public interest. The South Africa Press Council's Code of Conduct Preamble says, the media's work is guided at all times by the public interest. This is understood to describe information of legitimate interest or importance to citizens. Public interest is really important. If you think about media law, in certain media laws, there are exclusion clauses written in order for organizations that work in the public interest or individuals who might leak or share information in the public interest to be exempted from prosecution. The new Protection of Personal Information Act is an example. It's a bill. Is an example in point. The bill, the act, which was meant to protect government secrets, is also another one which the media fought incredibly hard to have a public interest clause inserted, so that if they got hold of government secrets, there wouldn't be an issue if they released them in the public interest. So public interest is an important defense in law, if we can get it. But there is a problem, because of different journalistic values or education or how particular media companies are positioned, public interest is not well understood, often used as a knee-jerk response from professional journalists. Why are you doing this? Why are you pointing that camera in my face? Why are you invading my privacy in a private moment when I need to grieve? Because it's the public's right to know. Well, public interest doesn't equal the public's right to know. The public has a right to know. The public has a right to know what? The public doesn't have a right to know anything. Public interest does not mean whatever interests the public. It refers to serious matters about which the public as a whole has or should have a legitimate concern. Not one person, not one commercial company, but the public as a whole. The British Press Complaints Commission described the public interest in the following way. Public interest is served, it says, if the activity, in other words, the journalistic activity that you're about to engage in, maybe you're about to go undercover, maybe you're about to doorstep a particular source. Maybe you're about to pay some money to a criminal source for information. Now, normally you wouldn't do that, but they claim that you can if the activity is used to expose a crime or serious misdemeanor. Not to get information about a celebrity and who they're stooping, but, for example, to find out if some person has done something seriously wrong in society, such as human rights infringements, corruption. The public interest, it says, is also served if the story would help protect public health, safety, and other rights. In other words, if there is a clear public benefit, a social good, which emerges from serving the public interest, then that's in the public interest. Consequently, if you are trying to defend yourself, hopefully a judge will be able to see it that way. It's not whatever interests the public. And lastly, it says, if it exposes individuals involved in the public eye who live by their images and words, the public interest is served if the story would, quote, prevent people at large being misled by some statement or action of an organization or individual. So let's say politician X goes on the road and he has an affair. Is that news? Is publishing in the public interest? No. Is his private life, and it's really nothing that concerns anybody else. But let's say that particular person has a stance that they've publicly made from the podium about standing for conservative values, the value and sanctity of family. Hell, they even happen to be on the South African National AIDS Council. So they have made statements, and if those particular kinds of statements are at odds with what they are doing, then your job in the public interest, if these are public people, will prevent people at large being misled by what they say and what they do, and showing up that this person doesn't practice what they preach. Let's take a look at the South African Press Council Code of Practice, the one that you should have next to you that you're highlighting and writing on. Most codes of conduct stipulate what acts are and are not permitted in the public interest. So here's what the SA Press Council Code of Practice says that South African journalists can and can't do in the public interest. First of all, it says news should be obtained legally, honestly, fairly. Unless public interest dictates otherwise. So this is where we have a deontological point which deviates on the notion of public interest. Under 1.6, it says media representatives shall always identify themselves as such. Even on your Facebook profile, on your LinkedIn profile, on your blog, indicate that you're a journalist. When you're interviewing someone, speaking to someone, identify yourselves as a journalist. The only time you are not allowed to do that is unless public interest or their safety dictates otherwise. 3.3 from the Code of Practice says the following. The media shall exercise care and consideration in matters involving dignity and reputation. The dignity or reputation of an individual, this is now looking also at laws related to defamation, should only be overridden if it is in the public interest in the following circumstances. Remember that there is a public interest justification for defamation in South African law. So, only in the following circumstances. The facts reported are true or substantially true. If they're fake, you're in trouble. If you've made them up or your sources misled, you're in trouble. Or the reportage amounts to fair comment based on facts that are adequately referred to in the story and that are true or substantially true. So fair comment requires not that a person is making up their own facts, but that the facts are referred to in the story. And then finally, if the reportage amounts to fair and accurate reporting of court proceedings, which is on the record, parliamentary proceedings, or the proceedings of any quasi-judicial tribunal or forum, which is on the record. Section 5.1 of the Press Council Code says, except where it is strictly relevant to the matter reported and it is in the public interest to do so, the media shall avoid discriminatory or denigratory references to people's race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, and birth, nor shall refer to people's status in a prejudicial or pejorative context. What this means are things like you can't, for example, use the N-word or the K-word in a newspaper. You can't or shouldn't be using words that denigrate people on the basis of the fact they're married or unmarried, or that they're pregnant, or that they're Chinese, or that they're handicapped. And in actual fact, these details aren't really significant to the story unless it's part of the story and that there's a public interest justification for including that component as part of the story. All right? Some more issues around the public interest. Content which depicts a violent crime, other violence, or explicit sex should be avoided unless the public interest dictates otherwise, in which case prominent indication and warning must be displayed indicating that content is of a graphic and inappropriate for certain audiences such as children. This is now becoming a very tricky one because increasingly websites are now using user-generated content of stuff like people hurting each other, people having fist fights, teachers beating school children. Their school children are minors. And what's the exclusion here is that this should only ever be shown in the most extreme of circumstances, and you would have to motivate this in relation to a public interest justification for it. Unfortunately, most people on social media have no justification and they simply share that content willy-nilly. And they aren't aware of the damage that they're doing to people, institutions, and themselves. 11.3 points out, the media should not publish information that constitutes a breach of confidence unless the public interest dictates otherwise. And 11.3 specifically, for example, refers to ideas that if you take someone takes you into their confidence and they're giving you information or material and they're your confidential source, you are never to breach that, even if you might go to jail, unless there's a public interest that dictates that you should break that. For example, you might have discovering that they have a particular agenda and or they might have falsified certain information, the story changes and flips on them. 12. The media shall avoid all shady journalism, in which informants are paid to induce to give them information, particularly criminals. Aha! Except the material concerned ought to be published in the public interest, and the payment is necessary for this to be done. Magazines like You Magazine tend to have a record of paying sources. I think it was rumored that they might actually have paid for access to the video of people who are blackmailing Joost van der Westhuizen when he was caught in a video having kinky sex and potentially snorting cocaine. But this is also part of the orientation of that particular publication. Its editor would have to have a public interest justification for the reason that they did what they did, which would have to stand up to the press ombud, press council, and if they're sued, have to stand up in a court of law. The value of independence. What does journalistic independence mean to you? What it does not mean is a license to do or act as one pleases. I'm independent, don't touch me. I can shoot wherever I want. I can do whatever I want. I can say or print whatever I want. Independence does not equal license. Journalists work in structured organizations. They are accountable to all kinds of people. They are not independent. Our own views have to be balanced against editorial policy. Our own views are influenced by editors and sub-editors and line managers. then there needs to be some policy in the organization, whether it's social media policy, editorial policies, that speak to what and where our views need to show up. One of those, of course, is that we clearly identify editorial as editorial, reporting as reporting, and opinion as opinion. That's always really important. Independence implies that journalists and media organizations should not permit undue interference or influence on their work from business, religious, political, or other players, which would result in incorrect or slanted coverage. It means editors and journalists have to defend the independence of their media with the right to edit from commercial interests, the government, religious interests, special interests, and even the proprietors of the newspaper. And of course, the editors have a massive role to play in this regard. And so do organizations like the Freedom of Expression Institute and the SA National Editors Forum. So that when organizations like political parties, politicians, media owners start impinging on the right of the medium to be relatively independent, that they have to stand up and defend that independence. Because if they don't, and that independence is eroded, the credibility of that media mouthpiece is eroded, and the credibility of that media mouthpiece is the reason that people buy it or watch it in the first place. So here's a case study. It is an international case study. A columnist at the Financial Times wrote a column about a presentation that either the chairperson or director of Hewlett-Packard, big international company, had at, I think it was in Davos, at the World Economic Forum. And she happened to disagree in her column, which also includes opinion, about the specific views of that director or chairperson. The marketing and spokesperson of HP then wrote a letter to them in which they took umbrage at the way that column had criticized their august leader at Davos, and ended it saying the following: Financial Times management should consider the impact of unacceptable biases on its relationship with advertisers. Well, that was seen as a red flag to a bull, because it was seen that that particular line was a threat that if that columnist or writer would continue to be critical of Hewlett-Packard, then it would affect the relationship between them as an advertiser and FT management. In order to defend the independence of the Financial Times, the news editors and the columnists concerned took the unprecedented step of running a front page editorial, which looked a little like this. So it is the role of the media and particularly editors and journalists to vigorously defend their independence, even from their own owners. See here as an example the alleged battles between Alid Dasnois, D-A-S-N-O-I-S, and Iqbal Survey over the coverage of Nelson Mandela's death, and Dasnois' coverage of Sekunjalo's alleged impropriety, which was indicated in a public protector's report. Dasnois was summarily drummed out of independent as a result. But that was clearly seen by several people as an example of a media owner overstepping the mark and interfering in editorial independence, such that they would get rid of an editor that is not meeting their own requirements. So consequently, that would be an infringement on media independence. But you should also note that independence is relative. It's not absolute. it has to exist within the law. And a narrow view of independence often ignores considerations of media political economy as an influence of media practice. And we'll talk about that next year when you do the subject media political economy. Editors who even claim a vestige of editorial independence are appointed by owners or directors of the paper or broadcaster to do the sort of job known to be required by the established editorial approach of the newspaper. And if they do not, they will be sacked. Editors come and go, the paper stays the same. The same goes for journalists. Journalists are sometimes appointed by virtue of the fact that the editor or managers believe that you espouse the same kinds of values that you preach from the same hymn book. When there is a break in that trust between the managers and the editor, or the editor and the journalist, then what happens is very often that journalist or that editor is pushed or shoved out. Here's another view of media independence. Take a look at the image. This is one that caused a lot of fuss. It's Independent newspaper's former group executive, Karima Brown, and Independent's group editor for opinion and analysis, former, Vukani Mdee, decked out in ANC-branded clothing, attending the party's 103rd birthday celebrations in Cape Town. Now, there's no problems with these journalists covering this particular event as journalists, but given that everything is now distributed on Twitter, there was much of a hullabaloo when this trio showed up with their party political regalia, because people said they were journalists and were meant to be impartial and independent. Should journalists be allowed to be members of political parties? Should journalists be allowed to be office holders in political parties? Should journalists be able to like political party or politician statements on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram? Should journalists be allowed to wear party political regalia? Here was Karima Brown's response at the time. See what you think. She said, "I think the key issue here is not whether we don ANC colours or not. It is whether our professional ability to do our work as journalists are being impaired because we happen to have political views." So what she's saying there is, I'm allowed to have political views and associate with who I want to, but it's only when my political views interfere with my professional ability to do my work that becomes a problem. Here's what Mashweshwe Monare, then Deputy Editor of the Mail and Guardian, says. If you're going to openly narrow your colours to a particular political party by wearing its regalia, how then do you expect other parties to relate to you? For example, you openly support the DA or the EFF. How do you expect the ANC to treat you? The second problem is that when you become a member of a political party, you're expected to adhere to the discipline of that party. Then there'll be clear conflict of interest between your role as a professional journalist and a member and sympathizer of that party. There must be a distinction. Remember, as journalists, we derive our credibility from what people think about us. So obviously, that is potentially an example of an ethical dilemma. You really fancy a particular party. You want to put their badge up on your website, on your Twitter account. You want to endorse their politicians. Should you be allowed to? What does your code of conduct say? How will that influence your independence or the perception of your independence as a journalist, and consequently your work with other sources? How that will affect your ability to be viewed as being balanced and impartial. So what do you think? And what does the Press Council Code of Practice say about independence? We'll tell you in a moment. Before you do, I want to go to this concept of radical transparency. It's something that crops up in citizen journalism and in online media. It's the notion that when we publish something online, we need to be clear in the text about what our relationships are with the story itself, its context, and the people in the story. So, for example, you might be writing about a company that you previously used to work for. You might be writing for an organization where your wife works. You might be producing a documentary on a particular topic, but you happen to have shares in a particular company that's mentioned in the documentary. Radical transparency as an idea in new media, which is increasingly getting traction in traditional media, is that you need to have an open and upfront declaration in the story to say exactly what your colors are. So if you were to write a story about the ANC, you might also at the end have to declare Karima Brown is a member of the African National Congress, but this story does not reflect her personal political views. Do you get me? Radical transparency, I think, is something that all journalists and young journalists need to fight for in South African media, because it says two things. That we are relatively independent. We're not entirely independent, but it does say we will declare and be honest and transparent about our biases when the story demands it. So radical transparency. Take it, write it down, look up that concept. Independence. Code of conduct. In the Press Code of Conduct, it says the following about independence. The media shall not allow commercial, political, personal, or other non-professional considerations to influence or slant reporting. Conflict of interest must be avoided, as well as arrangements or practices that could lead audiences to doubt the media's independence and professionalism. So if we were to go back to that case study of the journalist wearing ANC regalia, the argument here in the press code is that conflicts of interest must be avoided. Not that they should never happen or they won't ever happen, but they should be avoided because they are deleterious to the public's view of media's credibility, media's professionalism, and media independence. A teleological value is applied in having to assume what the reasonable audience member would think, however. Because some people might see that and say there's no problem. Others might, and might think that there is a problem. So whether it is or isn't a problem will depend on your point of view. And of course, how you as the journalist in that situation justify your position in relation to your professional values. So getting the picture? Independence is also about your ability to seem independent and work independently. And it's also contained in issues around bribes and brown envelope journalism. In 2.2 it says, the media shall not accept a bribe, gift, or any other benefit, brown envelope journalism, whether it is intended or likely to influence coverage. Now, media is sometimes given freebies. They are sometimes given gifts. They might sometimes be bought beer or a meal. But whatever the benefit is, whatever it is, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And issues around bribing of journalists, whether it is with free meals or trips or accommodation or even, friendly advice, is that we have to look at what this means. In Cape Town, the former Western Cape Premier Ibrahim Rasool was found to have bribed Cape Argus journalist Ashley Smith and political editor Joseph Aranes to influence coverage in his battle with an ANC political rival, James Ngulu. They were both contending for the chairship of the ANC in the Western Cape. That always gets dirty. And he was paying them to write positive material about him. When that was discovered, both of those journalists were fired. Independence. The media shall indicate clearly when an outside organization has contributed to the cost of news gathering, example, travel stories. So once again, it's radical transparency. If something has been bought or paid for, you shall declare it in a story. Don't have these beautiful travel stories and not indicate that the company paid for your trip, etc. And then editorial matter shall be kept clearly distinct from advertising and sponsored content. For example, advertorial and native advertising. In other words, through design, maybe you might use a different font, maybe you might use a different color, through the way you write and through labeling, you need to indicate whether advertorial advertising masquerading as editorial in the stories and native advertising online are native advertising or actual journalism. Not to do so would be seen to be impacting on your independence, because it means that, or suggests that you are for sale. Now let's look at balance. A story that favors a particular party, where the facts of the matter are true and correct, is also not unbalanced. There are a lot of times that you see stories published with only one source. It's not necessary that if there's only one source, a story is unbalanced. It is just true that life is complex and that people have many different perceptions of what the meanings of the facts are. However, it should be pointed out that a particular story is not necessarily unbalanced if it doesn't have a second side to it. However, if it is an important public interest story, if the story does involve multiple stakeholders, if the story is of a particular type, then it does demand balanced facts. It does demand balanced perspectives. And then we have to stick to the principle of audi alteram partem. Let the other side be heard. Secondly, failing to get comment from an important party when engaging in selective research, for example, cherry-picking facts that supports only one side of an argument, results in unbalanced reporting. There was an example of this that I saw a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, about once again, an independent journalist who wrote a front-page story about alcohol fetal syndrome and cited some research, which was anonymous research, which was actually untrue, which the Premier of the Western Cape, Helen Zille, took to task, and the independent media was quick to defend the independence of their journalist, but the journalist actually got the facts wrong. The journalist cherry-picked facts which were incorrect in order to support their side of the story and used that to lambase the record of the Western Cape government around the issue of FAS. So one also has to be aware of that, because that in itself is an example of fake news, cherry-picking information. And of course, consequently, it's unbalanced reporting. Also, exaggerating an issue implies a lack of balance, undue prominence, in other words, not giving sufficient weight to a particular issue. For example, it's a really significant and important story, but you hide it on page 7 rather than put it on page 3 or page 1, also implies a lack of balance. Omitting key facts in a story deliberately to favor one side or another also implies lack of balance. The journalist should present the audience with the most prominent arguments and also the weight that they enjoy. Related to the idea of impartiality and unfairness, balance is sometimes taken to extremes. Some people will say, oh, equal time and equal space on TV and radio. If the ANC is getting so much airtime, the DA must get so much airtime, or must get airtime relative to the number of people they have in Parliament. Legally, that only really applies during the periods of the elections and only on the public broadcaster. So one has to be careful of the notion of balance, and particularly when political parties attempt to use that to say that they are not receiving fair coverage of their specific issues. The idea of balance is summed up in this maxim: audi alteram partem, let the other side be heard. Being balanced means that you're even-handed. You don't prioritize one set of facts over another. You don't cherry-pick facts. You don't give undue prominence to certain sets of facts. It means not giving one side of the story undue attention to its advantage or disadvantage. Think of Rawls' veil of ignorance and the attendant emphasis it places on justice as fairness. Balance is being fair. It means stepping behind the veil of ignorance and saying, how would I write this story if I stepped out behind the veil of ignorance and I indeed was the person being written about, and I was not being given an opportunity to state my case or claim, or my ideas weren't given due prominence. The previous image speaks of balance based on the fact that life is complex and people have different perceptions of things that are supposed to be facts. For example, in Western society, some people view people who wear the burqa as being, which is the female garb of a woman, which only her eyes show, as being a subject to male patriarchy and consequently being oppressed as women. Whereas, on the other side, women in that society might view women in Western society who go about wearing skimpy clothing, thinking that they are empowered by virtue of what they get to wear, as also being subject to male patriarchy, since they are therefore exposing themselves to the male gaze. There are always more than two sides to every story. So what is the value of balance, and how is it reflected in the SA Press Code of Practice? Under 1.8, the Press Code of Practice says, the media shall seek the views of the subject of critical reportage in advance of publication, provided this need not be done where the institution has reasonable grounds to believe that if they were to tell someone that they were going to publish, that they would be prevented from reporting, where evidence might be destroyed or sources intimidated, or because it's impracticable to do so in the publications. But it does state that reasonable time should be afforded the subject for response. If the media are unable to obtain such a comment, this shall be reported. So two really important things here in terms of balance. The first is, at all times, attempts to seek the other side to the set of allegations. But if there's very strong belief that the other side is going to tamper with evidence, destroy evidence, intimidate sources, hurt or kill somebody, or indeed even interdict the publication of that particular story, then it is reasonable to assume, says the Press Council, that you can publish without that point of view. It's not ideal, but it would be regarded as being ethical in terms of the Press Code of Conduct. So that's an issue in which balance, a story would not be balanced, but it would not be balanced because to attempt to balance it would mean that the story itself might not be published or the sources in the story might be harmed. A second principle is that when you are attempting to balance a story, you need to give the other side, particularly where there is a conflict involved, you need to give the other side a reasonable amount of time to respond. Don't send the questions 1 hour before deadline, because they're not going to be able to even respond to some of the allegations put to them if they cannot read it. And of course, the last and third point is that at all times, if you can't get comment, you need to indicate that you can't get comment. So in terms of balance, if you cannot get comment, if it's not practicable, you can and must state that the information was not available. Under 1.9, Where a news item is published on the basis of limited information, this shall be stated as such, and the reports should be supplemented once new information becomes available. This is about making sure that if your story is published and needs to be updated, it is updated. And if your story is unbalanced because you couldn't get quote now, couldn't get information now, indicate and seek that information at a later point. And state in your story, Mr. James refused to comment. Mr. James was not available for comment. Now there's a difference there. Not available meant that either said they're unavailable, they're out of the country. Refused to comment says, I don't want to comment. And how about this? Sometimes there's a legal reason that commentary is not possible, and that needs to be indicated. Mr. Modise said the case was sub judice and he was not allowed to comment. That is important as anything else to try to balance out the story. However, if you don't seek out the other side, you cannot put this in. He was not available to comment because you didn't phone him. He wasn't available to comment because you didn't have their WhatsApp number. In that instance, don't publish the story at all. Balance also means carefully weighing competing values, such as public interest against other values, such as the right to privacy, vulnerability, potential to cause hatred, war, etc. In the Code of Practice under 1.2, it states, news shall be presented in a context and in a balanced manner, without any intentional or negligent departure from the facts, whether by distortion, exaggeration, or misrepresentation, material omissions or summarization. So, in other words, balance also equals any attempt to in any way produce fake news by highlighting one side or another, distorting facts through the use of words or opinion, exaggerating the situation, misrepresenting the situation, leaving out some facts and not others, or summarizing the situation in such a way that it does not lead to a comprehensive view of the issue. The problem of a lack of balance. Issues in life are complex. Often our news tends to report stuff in simplistic ways. Those of you who have been involved in Fees Must Fall or student protests will see the kind of coverage that takes place in the mainstream press and on radio and television as a consequence of the amount of time necessary to tell a story and the amount of detail that journalists seek out. The issue of student protests is complex, the myriad of different points of view and experiences, but only a small subset of these are represented in our press and in our media. And so consequently, there is an imbalance that people see in representation, which leads people to say that the media aren't fair in reporting on certain issues because they report on issues and provide largely single-sourced issues focusing on the spokesperson for those organizations and the results or outcome of a particular event, such as a fire, an explosion, or a closure, as opposed to investigating the root causes in any great depth or the experiences of different groups or categories of people. So issues in life are complex. Basic news reporting fails to often capture the complexity when it fails to acknowledge the significance of multiple views, what we call multi-perspectivality, on the facts of a case or their importance or interpretation in a particular context. This view of accuracy, above all, links to two other journalistic values: comprehensiveness and completeness. This speaks to the idea that we should avoid publishing if we only have part of the story, and you can see how that was captured in the Press Council's Code of Conduct. The only time when we should avoid not balancing out a significant story if there's a professionally justifiable reason to do so. Life is complex, and everyone has a story, we are told. But the problem with journalism is very often it only gives us one side. The stories of the social elites, the people who have spokespersons, the powerful who have access to the means of reproduction of knowledge and publication. Consequently, the notion of balance, the notion of multi-perspectivality is of utmost importance to good journalism. I'd like you to Google Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's the author of Half a Yellow Sun, and she's a Nigerian author and writer. And if you Google Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and TED Talks, you'll get a video of hearing her talk about the danger of a single story, why people risk misunderstanding the other person, when they only hear one kind of story their entire lives. I urge you to do so. I think you might also find the link on Blackboard. Impartiality. Now, impartiality is a value closely related to the idea of balance. It also implies not taking sides, not giving undue prominence to the views and opinions of particular persons and bodies and issues. Because when we do give prominence to a particular person or body or issue, to a political party, to an individual, to a company, to a concept like white monopoly capital, what we do is we prime the audience to think about that concept or person in particular ways. Can you remember priming from your media studies courses? Priming is where a medium foreground gives prominence to one issue or another, thereby influencing how people think about the topic. So when we are not impartial, one of the consequences is that we prime and consequently engage in propaganda. Can you think of examples where media may not have been impartial on a particular issue? Where media seem to foreground certain organizations or themes or stories based on things like kinships or media ownership or political relations or business relations? We'll think about this and talk about this in more depth in next year's Political Economy of the Media course. Fair dealing. Fair dealing means treating your sources and audiences fairly with similar time and attention. This means not making false promises that your stuff will get published, not promising to reward sources, because that can be seen as bribing sources, not misrepresenting yourself to get information, unless in the public interest. Identifying yourself as a journalist and ensuring the interviewee knows what the information is on record and what the purpose of the interview is always important. You do that in the first 30 seconds. Every interviewee must know that you are a journalist and everything that they say thereafter will be on record, unless they tell you that it is off the record. It's important to tell people, particularly people who haven't dealt with the media, this up front, so that they are able to engage with you properly. Not everybody has the same level of sophistication when it comes to the media. Not everybody knows what on the record and off the record is. But it's also important for junior journalists, don't go and write a story and say, this will appear in tomorrow's paper, this will appear in tomorrow's broadcast, because sometimes it doesn't, it won't, or it won't get prominent. All of this is part of fair dealing with the source and fair dealing with the audience. And consequently, these are significant journalistic values. Now, fair dealing is related to the value of balance. It also relates to the idea of giving the opposing side or other sides the opportunity for reply. But fair dealing is also about having due regard for the story itself. Fair dealing means explaining and being complete. Every story comes from somewhere. Every story has a context. And so what's significant is also in fair dealing is that you fair deal with your audience. Some people wouldn't know the background of a particular story, a crime story or a politics story, until you explain to them. So you need to be able to at least include in the stories that you write some context so that people who are reading for the first time are not ignorant of the facts surrounding an issue. Of course, online and websites, this can be done using hypertext links. In an actual article, if the story is an ongoing story or follow-up, you need to include context from the previous story. That is part of fair dealing with the audience. The press code states the following: where a report is not based on facts or is founded on opinion, allegation, rumor, or supposition, it shall be presented clearly in such a manner as to indicate this. Right? This is also another reason why we make a distinction in our reporting between the sections of our newspaper that houses opinion and commentary in the middle of our pages and editorial and reporting, which is in the first pages of our title. We must distinguish between opinion and editorial and advertorial and advertising at all times if we are to deal fairly with our audience. They need to know what is fact and what is opinion. We need to help them. In an age of fake media organizations don't do that. They present everything as if the facts are clear, where clearly it supports and provides support for a very specific point of view or agenda. I want you to quickly look at this slide. This slide is a piece of research that was conducted by some researchers and academics at the University of South Africa, including Julie Reid from University of South Africa and Taryn Isaacs from Nelson Mandela University. And they took a look at the Press Council's judgments and what were the kinds of things that the public was complaining about. Let's see what the kinds of things were the public was complaining about and see how they relate to the values that we're talking about. Good journalism equals good values after all. So, the first thing was complaints about truth, accuracy, and fairness. Wow, those are prime journalistic values, and now we know what it means to be fair to sources, to be fair to the audience. 8% of complaints was about truth and accuracy. We'll speak about accuracy just now, but this is about journalists simply not getting the facts right. More than 8% of all complaints were about issues around accuracy and the rest about fairness, probably about issues of not having their side of the story heard or not giving significant prominence to all the facts. The next category down was balance, context, distortion, exaggeration, misrepresentation, omission, and summarization. Those issues relate to the value of balance, also to the value of fair dealing and impartiality. And up to 4.2% of all complaints to the Press Council of South Africa was around issues of balance. Seeking comment prior to publication, 3.5%. That's fairly high. And what it means is that organizations, news organizations and journalists probably did not seek comment from significant parties prior to publication, and consequently stories were unbalanced. 2.4, we can link that accuracy of the entire report, 2.4%. 2.1% dignity and reputation. And that's a tricky one because obviously there's a public interest defense there. Headlines and captions, probably misrepresentation there, but that's also about fair dealing. You tell the reader, what story they can expect. And number 7 and 1.2 was only what is reasonably true may be presented as fact. And that was also about fair dealing, when you present opinions rather than facts. Accuracy. This should have been our number 1. Accuracy is important in the fake news era, but even before. It's the premise, it's the underlying soul of what journalism should stand for. Some people say journalism is the science of verification. Some people say journalism stands for the truth with a capital T. I always ask, whose truth? If there are multiple points of view, then whose truth are you capturing? The only way that you capture any notion of truth is by capturing the multiple points of view on the truth. So we can link the idea of accuracy, the value of accuracy, to Edmund Lambert's principle of truth-telling. Accuracy is vital. Credibility and trust in the media is linked to a medium's ability to produce accurate news and information and critical opinion, to spell correctly, to get the correct facts, to line them up, to verify that information, and get credible opinion from credible sources on the ground. All of this is linked to accuracy. The media should take care to report news truthfully, accurately, and fairly. Accuracy means that you've got to do your homework. You have to have the time to do effective news gathering and research and verification. In an age where media organizations are striving to be first rather than right, the challenge, however, is that there's a struggle to get an accurate version of the facts because we are unable to verify those facts prior to publication, particularly more significant ones. Good research is hard to do. Whether it's desktop research to get facts, you can think about your data journalism test results last year and how terrible students were at just checking on and getting the right facts that are required. Is so-and-so a doctor? If such, what are their qualifications? Whose Twitter account is this? All of these related to allowing you to use desktop tools to verify for accuracy. Those complaints to the press ombudsman, as you could see, was a result of inaccuracy. As I keep on saying to students, journalists have to be better. You need to learn to listen and know enough so that you're able to report accurately and consequently uphold your credibility. Inaccuracy might creep in to newspapers with mistakes in spelling and fact due to lazy journalism. Journalism, where we just take stuff from press releases without thinking about it. Poor research, because we don't spend enough time looking at our stories. Poor source selection, because instead of finding good first-hand sources and witnesses and people directly involved in stories who have the ability to tell us what we need to know, we go to secondary sources, other websites. We don't find the right witnesses. We use people who are close to us as sources instead of building new sources. We select single sources. We take stuff from fake news websites and accounts. There's poor sub-editing because sub-editors are under tremendous amount of pressure. There's changes to content. For example, as content moves into a content management system and is changed by other sets of hands, headlines and leads in the production cycle might change, and consequently misrepresentation between headline and the story might creep in. Massaging information in the news workflow can also lead to inaccuracy. Any changes that sub-editors make to make the story more attractive, more sexy, when it gets shortened, can also lead to inaccuracy if you don't have adequately trained individuals. Adding to this problem is the fact that news organizations in South Africa don't have fact checkers in their newsroom. Most newsrooms in America and Europe do. These are people that are employed to check the important facts that journalists come back with to make sure that they're absolutely 100% correct. Not only do South African media not have fact checkers, but there are now even fewer sub-editors than before, under a tremendous amount of pressure as a result of downsizing. And then there's the journalists themselves. Journalists and student journalists who fail to check basic details such as spelling, age, location, relationships when writing a story. For example, if I was to tell you this person's name was Mr. Chumley, would it be the spelling on the left or the right? The answer, the spelling on the left. If you were writing down someone's name and the person said his name was Sean Brown, is it S-H-A-U-N, S-E-A-N? Is it B-R-O-W-N-E? Is it B-R-A-U-N? Always ask. The sub-editor's maxim is, when in doubt, leave out. If there are important facts and you don't know if it's true or accurate or who said it because the journalist didn't do their work, you've got to leave it out. The journalist's maxim should be, when in doubt, ask. If you are confused, if you don't know what something means, ask what it means. This way, it will contribute to greater accuracy in your work. When in doubt, ask. Let's take a look at how accuracy is reflected in the Code of Conduct of the Press Council. The Press Council states, a Code of Conduct states, where there is reason to doubt the accuracy of a report or a source, and it is practicable to verify the accuracy thereof, it shall be verified. Where it has not been practicable to verify the accuracy of a report, this shall be stated in such a report. In other words, in order to protect our credibility, if there are significant facts that you have not been able to verify, and you are going to write a report based on it, these should not be given due prominence, and at least in the story, if it is published, it should be stated that this information is not verified. Most credible publications don't even publish that at all. If it doesn't have a credible source, if it hasn't been verified, they won't include that. They'll simply not report the story at all. The Sunday Times has, on its most important stories, a requirement that their political journalists triple source information, particularly where it's of significant value, and particularly where stuff is contentious, so that there can be balance and verification and accuracy if challenged by parties. Also in the Code of Conduct states, the media shall seek the views of the subject of critical reportage in advance of publication, providing that this need not be done where the institution has reasonable grounds for believing that doing this might prevent reporting. Okay, you will see that that relates to the earlier issue of fair dealing, but this also relates to accuracy in the sense that where you are not able to get the other side, you need to state so. You are to attempt to try to get the other side at all times by providing a reasonable time. That adds to accuracy, and that also adds to greater comprehensive reporting, which are also two other news values: comprehensiveness and completeness. .9 of the Press Code of Conduct says, where a news item is published on the basis of limited information. This shall be stated as such, and the report should be supplemented. As I pointed out previously, this is also part of accuracy. It's part of balance and fair dealing. This view simply states that in order to have and value the value of accuracy, our journalistic work must be comprehensive and should be complete. And if it's not complete, our stories need to be updated, and people need to be told about the previous context for the story. Right. So where a news item is published and there's limited information, the audience should be told you're not being given the full story, and further updates will be available. So we are being accurate and being fair by telling the reader that we haven't provided them with a full report of the news, but we've only provided them with a portion. Stand by for more. Okay, so we've covered some primary journalistic values. Those aren't all of them. Don't confuse journalistic values, by the way, and editorial values. Okay, editorial values are learned as news values in first year, such as bizarreness and prominence and scale. Please don't confuse that with professional values. If you have any questions about any of this, please tweet me using the hashtag #HashJourn2. And don't forget to look at the question for your assignment, which is due on 11 October. It's in the form of a blog. I didn't promise, though, that for those people who've waited so long, that I would include a link to a previous student journalist's example of their blog, so you can use that as an example for how you should produce your own. So, surprise! In your assignment, you're going to have to deploy all the theory you've learned today to discuss the values involved in a specific ethical dilemma. I've given you 4 options for different kinds of ethical dilemmas you can choose. You're going to have to think about the legal issues involved in that particular problem, because for a deontological complete point of view, you need to know what the law says about things like defamation or invasion of privacy, if that's the issue that's involved. You also need to know what policies say. For example, policies, if you're covering issues around wearing of party political regalia, what does policy say? So you need to interrogate what the law says and what policies say about a particular problem. And then you address the ethical issues involved in the case. And to do that, you need to talk about what the professional values are that are involved, how they clash, what the Press Code of Conduct says, what the BCCSA Code of Conduct says. Use both. See how they work. And then after stating that clearly, you're going to need to resolve the problem through a reasoned ethical motivation. And you can do that by employing a single classical ethical framework. You're going to do that in the form of a blog post. Please, for your assignments, do not use your lecture notes, this stuff that I've got. Please do not cite me, Jude Mathurin said, and please do not copy and paste from this video or copy and paste from other sources online. You'll be severely penalized, and plagiarism will receive 0. Do use readings on the... So remember, do not use your lecture notes, do not cite me, do not copy and paste, do not plagiarize. And here is that promised link. Create a space and power at wordpress.com, and the story is called Anonymous Sources, Press Freedom, Friend or Foe. Okay? Anonymous Sources, Press Freedom, Friend or Foe. Please give it a look. I will see you next week.